Well, welcome everybody to the Friday knowledge sharing module for CXPS for this year, number 12. It's all about the Benjamins, the role of pricing, budgeting, and invoicing in your CX program. I thank you all for watching the video and participating in a conversation that I feel pretty strongly about, primarily because my CX philosophy is to control those things that you know are a given. That is the number one philosophy that I build around. And in any professional relationship, there is a sure exchange of money and value. That's why you have a professional relationship. So, in my opinion, if you can anticipate something like this, you should build a program around the exchange of money. I know that you all watched the video, and so I'd love to start with any questions. I don't know if there's a particular format that you want me to follow. Like if you want to go through, I have prepared some questions to encourage dialogue among us because I think that's where the best ideas come from. Or if anybody had any specific questions about what was in the video, so we can start there. And then, sure, go ahead, Mitch.
All right. I loved hearing you talk a little bit about the structuring of the invoice. Love the concepts that you talked about with making sure to review the invoice, contact the client, ensure them that the invoice is so to speak in the mail or in the email, and that it is going to meet budget projections and there shouldn't be any surprises and that type of thing. No surprise invoicing, so key. But you talked about the whole idea of demonstrating value. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about trying to, I think you called it an impact statement. And it sounded like you were saying, go ahead and put your impact statement into the invoice. So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So I have been fortunate over the years to be trained and go through a number of trainings from pricing specialists and the psychology around pricing. And pricing, especially in professional relationships, is, as I mentioned, about delivering value, right? Like somebody needs something from you, you're delivering it, and then hence an exchange of money. And at any given, there's a pricing philosophy out there that at any given moment you should be ready to tell the CEO of your clients what they have received in exchange for the money that they've paid you. So if you were at a networking event and the CEO of your biggest client comes up to you and says, I see that we just completed this project, or I see that we just issued an invoice, I saw an invoice, you should be ready at any moment to deliver, here's what you got for the price that you paid. And that isn't just tactics, that isn't just a completion of a project, and that isn't just work product. A lot of times that's what problem did we solve for the client, and where did we either reduce spend or increase revenue. So I like to design, I'm a big fan of, I believe the word value is kind of thrown around too often. Everything is about value, value this, value that. And to me, when a client there's a client delivery relationship, value is, did you save me money? Did you make me money? So that's kind of a little bit of background to your question, Mitch. And when I'm talking about impact statements on an invoice, it can be something, there's a whole spectrum of ideas that you can use. It can be something as simple as, here's how it met your objective. You identified this objective. Here's how close we are to your objective. It could be something of saving you money, making you money. It can be where we reduced waste. It could be, here's what you got for that phase. So if you look at the typical invoice, it says, here's the hours we billed, or here's the portion of the project we completed, but it doesn't really talk about what that actually added to the overall organization, or where you're reducing their pain. So what problems you're solving or reducing pain. So it can look like a continuum of any solutions, but I think it's important, even if it's one line, to say, here's how this speaks to your overall objective, or here's how this removed something from your plate. So I think it tells a story in something you know they're going to look at, and you know that they're going to reference. So to add those small, short summary sentences is really important. And it doesn't even have to be around each line item. It can just say, this month, here's what we've accomplished, or here's where we're at relative to your overall objectives. So I think when you do that, you're building a story in tandem by saying, here's my expectations for you. It's reinforcing what you've provided. Does that answer your question, Mitch?
Yeah, I love that. I think you gave great detail about how that can work for us. And it seems, and it doesn't have to be complicated, you know. In fact, it should relate back to the goal and objectives of the initial project outcomes, right? So that you're hopefully restating what was an intended value or benefit that comes out of it. Love
Absolutely.
that. Love that. One of the other things that I thought was really awesome that I'm hoping that I can figure out how to steal is the no charge line items. We've centralized our billing. So a billing analyst does the draft invoices for our clients. And whenever we want to make an improvement, I'm thinking how great it would be to say, okay, were you able to deliver something in addition to, or that might have been slightly outside of scope, but it didn't justify a change order or something like that, but that we could, you know, note that was an additional deliverable of sorts. I think that's brilliant.
I think capturing those pieces too, not only go to my initial point of educating your audience on what goes into pricing or what goes into the delivery of services. And it, you know, I think we can all recognize that in the delivery of my presentation, I spoke more generally, right? Because everybody has different software, everybody has different protocols, processes, procedures. But if you are not able to make a change because it's too much of a rigmarole, I can't think of another word besides a rigmarole. That happens, that comes to mind. But you can always put it in a summary in an email. I don't typically, back to the impact statements, I do find that a lot of outside partners will summarize their impact in the email. And while that's absolutely useful and beneficial, you want to make sure that it's directly attached to the money. Now, if you're unable to modify your invoices, you can certainly put a summary in your email. I just want you to know that we consider this an investment in the relationship, and I want you to know that these are the investments that we made this month. So phrasing it like that doesn't feel also like a litany of all of the things that you did and didn't charge. So I find that that's very well received because it feels like a give. It doesn't feel like I'm going to ask you for something, like a favor. I'm going to ask you for something. It feels like a reinforcement of I value this opportunity. I appreciate it. And I want you to know that here are the steps that we've taken to make sure that we're always meeting your expectations, or we're exceeding them, or we're going to grow this relationship. So I find that if it's too much of a hassle or too much, it's not an option to modify your invoicing system, that's some way you can do it. You can add a summary statement on the front end. You can put it in your communication. So another thing to think through.
Great thoughts, because I imagine we end up giving away a lot during an invoicing process where we say, you know, we had to do this additional 3 or 4 hours of work. And that ended up being something where we say, okay, we're just going to write that off. It was a $45,000 project. We did this 3 hours of additional accounting cleanup and that type of thing. And yet, if it's not documented, if it's not clarified, it becomes an expectation that that's what you're going to do in the future.
And I have found, I'd be curious to hear what others think, but I found that there's a lot of insecurity around sharing that somehow we didn't understand our own pricing, or we mismanaged something on our end, or you don't want to get into the conflict of this wasn't in the initial scope, and therefore it's easier just to write it off. And so I think ultimately it becomes just a communication and relationship tool, and it doesn't have to feel tense, which is kind of the whole purpose of my presentation, is that everybody tiptoes around the money conversations, but really it's a communication conversation, and it reinforces your appreciation, your gratitude, your care for the level of relationship. So thank you.
Andrea, if I want to ask you to build on that, because knowing the mastery you have with language and expression, I think building on Mitch's point, which by the way, Happy New Year, Mitch. And everyone else too, but especially Mitch. I would be interested in language for things like, you know, when we think of, we wrote off the time, that has it lands in sort of that space of shame, and like, there was something awry, so we couldn't charge for it, versus calling it something else. Can you speak a little bit more to, and this may be sort of in the same vein as impact language, but anything you might add around just even how you express those investments that you make in a client project or with client time.
Absolutely. Thanks for raising that point. I mean, right there, calling them investments versus write-offs is a huge difference. Simple, no cost. So you've got a lot of what I included in my presentation. I also want to point out is at no cost to implement. So when you're looking at your CX program and you're thinking about low-hanging fruit that has a big difference, your language is really important, and it doesn't cost you anything to implement. So one, using the word investments instead of write-offs is really important. And that can either be on your invoices in a separate category as a line item charge or in that summary. So I've seen it work a variety of different ways, one of which is something simple like saying there's no extra charge for this, or this is at no cost to you, or this is just an investment. I've seen them summarized saying, we appreciate this and it's our objective to get to know you. And in doing so, we are willing to invest X amount of time, or here are the things that we've done this month to ensure success or invest in the relationship. So I think kind of combining what Deb said and what Mitch was asking is I think you can use it depending on what systems and what sort of tactical resources you have, whether that's invoicing, summaries, what your process is for billing. I think it can be, I think the point is to use the reinforcing language about investments and gratitude and long-term benefit and value, and to scope it in a way in anything that currently exists. So another key point, thank you for raising that, Deb, because I think that is another important point to raise. One, these don't cost you anything to implement. Two, you can attach these sorts of recommendations to something that already exists. So when you implement something like a no charge or an impact statement or a value add, you can add it on to something that your company, your organization, or your client teams already have in place. So it's not going to require you to go through some giant committee meeting and get 12 approvals and hire an outside consultant to scope something. Very, very easy changes. Their word changes, their language changes. There's something you can deliver on your own time, which I think are really important to note, especially when you're trying to advance a relationship and engender loyalty. It sets the tone.
Andrea, when you're doing that, what do you think the relative advantages or differences are between, say, in Mitch's example, 3 or 4 hours of accounting cleanup versus time invested to reduce risk of an audit?
Mm-hmm.
Those are, I wouldn't want to put 3 or 4 hours on there because that might be some of the most valuable stuff you've contributed. And to say it's only 3 or 4 hours might diminish the real impact of we went the extra mile to reduce your risk of an audit or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I think that's probably where Deb was driving at. I think when you can ever scope any sort of language around your value and the impact, so the impact to the organization and how it ties to either increased value or reduced risk, I think is essential. And so again, it's a cultural thing, I think, and who would help you phrase that language, how you would ensure that it's consistent across an organization, how you would decide on which nomenclature to use and what's appropriate for which client. So I think it's organization dependent, but anytime that you can scope directly around an objective or an increased value for your client, that language matters. Did that answer your question, or do you want to?
I think it was more the point of not putting the number of hours you gave instead of the value proposition, because do you risk diminishing the value of the gift by putting a number of hours on there rather than just putting the value proposition in there?
I honestly, on one hand, I totally see what you're saying, and I think that is the most important piece to include. On the other hand, I'm a big proponent of transparency and what transparency does around your pricing relationship generally. So I think a lot of times we are apt to not share those details of how much time went into something, either because it puts us, it undermines what the overall value was, or because we feel vulnerable about it, or we are afraid they'll use that against us in some way, or compared to our competitors. There's a host of reasons why we limit that sharing. But I found that if you're willing to step into that, I can see how it increases the reciprocal relationship that is required in a pricing conversation. So I am a firm believer, it's my professional belief, that the more information we share and the more they understand about how long something takes, or the factors that will increase or decrease the price, only increase trust and reduce pricing and billing squabbles later. So I'm a big fan of that along the way. So on one hand, I love focusing the conversation all around the value and the mitigated risk and the objective. And then on the other hand, I'm a big proponent of the increased transparency.
Building on Ryan's question, Andrea, would there be a similar value from your experience if you didn't quantify time, but you just quantified the dollar amount? So again, where you're not putting an attachment to 3 to 4 hours at whatever effective billing rate times 3 or 4, but if you were to say, we put $1,500 worth of investment time to help reduce your audit risk, then again, the backing into the hourly rate, I suspect somebody might be able to do that, but now it starts to feel maybe a little bit like a bucket of investment dollars, basically dollars they didn't have to spend, whether that was 1 hour of work or that was 10 hours of work, that there is a way to unitize the value. Is that something that would be, have you seen that, or is that something you would recommend?
Great point. And I think the overarching umbrella of points there is that you have options. So you have options that should be tailored to that particular relationship and those particular objectives. So what necessarily, this is an important piece of kind of this money conversation, right? You knew I had to do this at one point during this session. Pricing, budgeting, billing, and these conversations about the transfer of money should not be entirely systemic. So there should be a systemic approach or a value-based, but they should be based on those client relationships and what your client is interested in, where they're at in their own price sensitivity or billing sensitivity, and you should tailor accordingly. So I think the most important part to know is, one, that you have options. You have options when you talk about how to reinforce that value, reinforce the time, reinforce the investment, and that can look like a statement, that could look like a record of hours, and that can look like a dollar amount. And I think it's important to think about what your client will most receive and what will meet them where they're at in that conversation. So that's a very good point. And in addition to that, I like the idea of what Deb is raising, because if you are one of the organizations that provides an annual impact report, one, I'd love to talk to you because I'd love to hear more about that. But it also is typically organizations that deliver a client impact report to a client, or they know their client is looking at, like, how much did we spend with XYZ firm this year? It's lovely to have that balance it out. So if somebody in the finance department is looking at how much did we spend with Client Savvy this year, not only will they have an impact statement to say, well, here's what we got, here's perhaps what the alternative cost was, and here's how much they invested back in us. So anytime that you can capture those tangible and intangible benefits, I'm a huge proponent. And so the main takeaway, the thing to write down, is that you have options that should be tailored to your firm culture as well as your individual client relationships.
And I guess to Deb's point there, if you do see a line item that says $1,500 and here's what I got, the client could say, wow, I want that on all my projects. And you've just turned a free line item into an upsell for future engagements.
Well, and another thing, and not to spend all of our time on pricing, but another thing is when you use specific dollar amounts, you're providing an anchor. So you're providing the point of comparison, and you have to think about when you want to anchor and provide that comparison, because your clients are comparing that 15. Let's just use that $1,500 charge. They're comparing that not only to what they received from you in the past, what they will receive from you in the future, to Ryan's point, to your competitors, and to doing nothing. So when you decide to use specific numbers or ranges, or you're anchoring their comparison point. And sometimes that's crucial, that's critical, especially when you have an unsophisticated buyer, an uninformed buyer, a super complex project. It's important for you to drive those anchors and set those, but it's just a factor to be considerate of.
That provides a good thought, or good stuff to think about, because it's like Ryan was stating, do you give a gift with a price tag on it, or you're saying full disclosure. So where's the middle ground? And it's, but that leads me to my question. You talked about, we'll try to get a little bit away from pricing, was mainly about the guarantee versus discount. So is that more of a language? Because I mean, you could present the same idea of a guarantee or discount, but you're using different words. So does this go back to more of a language tool and how you present that?
That's a great question. And I will share with you, last night I was practicing with my husband, who is not pumped at all about any of this. And that was the one thing that stood out to him. He was like, what does that even mean? I don't even understand what you're talking about. So not only is that a language and a communication opportunity, but in my opinion, that's an expectation setting opportunity. And so I like to refer to the gap effect. I don't know if anybody here remembers or thinks about or shops at the Gap, but probably in what, maybe 2008, 2009, Gap started discounting everything. Like everything at the Gap is 40 to 50% off all the time. And so therefore, I will never buy anything from the Gap unless it is 40 to 50% off. Like, I don't know why they just don't change their pricing, but they can't change their pricing because they've now engaged in this conversation that says, big sale, 40% off. So in my professional services experience, I have found that at the onset of an engagement, or when you have a price sensitive client, or perhaps even just a competitive or greedy client, or even a client that just has a limited budget, they likely will often ask for a discount up front because they feel like when they're pricing, the psychology of pricing says, oh, I got something. I won something here. So I might hire you, who's the best of class, and you come and you say it's $1,500. And I'm like, would you give me 20% off on that? So this is a very, very, very common scenario. And I'm sure, raise of hands if you've experienced this on the front end of a sale. So therefore, what happens in that scenario is they're asking you for 20% off your rack rate, which effectively is creating you a new rack rate. Now, that sets the expectation for that client. That sets the expectation for the rest of the organization. And that sets the expectation before you're even delivering on the value that you've promised to provide. So you're engaging in a pricing relationship versus a value relationship. And you want to, as often as you can, use those conversations to move you toward value and outside of a transactional. That's a transaction. So what I'm suggesting by that is when a client comes to you and it's a new client and you really want the business, or it's a really good piece of work, or it's super opportunistic, that you say, I understand that this is important to you. And we've done a lot of diligence around the pricing, and here's how we came up with that pricing. Here's what it will look like on each stages. I assure you no surprises. And if anything should run amok, you will be informed. But in exchange, I will give you a guarantee. If we get to the end of this engagement and you are not satisfied, or you do not believe what we delivered was valuable, then we can renegotiate what this looks like. But we are so confident in our pricing that we're not willing to just reduce it on the front end. And we do want the relationship, and we do want the opportunity. And here are 5 ways that we're willing to invest in it in lieu of giving you a 20% off. So I find that it's not only, it's kind of one of those scary places that your salespeople or your end service providers hesitate to step into because they're like, oh, I really want the business. But what it does is it's, again, sets the relationship around value. It immediately engenders trust and respect more than it does fear and loss. And usually by the end of the engagement, if you've done everything correctly, you're delivering on that value, you're delivering above and beyond. And so I've seen it work, and usually people are hesitant or scared to use it on the front end, but by just issuing front end discounts, it's a race to the bottom. That's
a great analogy with the Gap. And are you going to buy a shirt now from Gap with the knowing it's always going to be on discount? So if you always offer a discount, people are going to expect the discount.
And to get on my pedestal here, I suppose that's why I got the microphone. But what does that say about the diligence you've put into your pricing? So if you are saying we put thoughtful thought behind what we proposed, and we know what we're doing, you can expect this from us. We've done this with lots of clients like you. We know what we're saying. What does that say about you if you're like, yeah, cool, 20% off? So it immediately discounts what you've stated as your value that you plan to deliver. And so I find that it does more harm. And frankly, I'd also be interested in a show of hands if anyone has ever not gotten at that point in the pricing conversation, if you've not gotten the engagement because you've refused to give the 20% off. So if they've gotten to the point where they've reviewed your proposal, they've chosen you as the provider, and now they're asking for the discount, I would be willing to bet that they're not going to walk away and start over again with an alternative provider. So I think you're at that point in the sales cycle, in again, which you have an opportunity to really engender loyalty and trust.
There's also an interesting psychology there, because at the beginning of the relationship, I'm invested in you because I did pick you, but I'm not that invested in you. And so my ability to be a decent, reasonable human being and beat you up over price is now. At the end of the project, if you say, I'll send you the final invoice at the end of the project, and if you don't think we were worth it, you can take 20% off then. Well, by the time you get to the end of the project, the psychology of looking at you and saying, no, Andrea, you weren't worth that 20%. I'm going to short pay you. It's a lot harder for someone to do. So I guess if you look at the psychology of that, the actual risk of offering that guarantee is pretty low. I doubt there's many takers who short pay that final invoice.
Well, and I will tell you, I'm so glad you said this. I will tell you that if you get to that point, if you get to the end of an engagement and you have a client that says, buddy, you were not worth it, I want the 20%, I'm going to exercise that 20%, you've got a whole nother problem. You don't have a pricing problem. You have a delivery problem. You have a process problem. You have a client engagement problem. You don't have a pricing problem.
Or
So
just a bad client.
I mean, yeah, perhaps, right? So by anyway, then red flags are raised and you're saving yourself in that regard. So just something to keep in mind.
Well, yeah, hopefully you're checking in with clients throughout the project timeline. I think that's the whole theory behind the CX.
Mm-hmm.
Just not waiting until the end to get the you suck.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, I put all of those points under budgeting, statement of work, project plan. So the nomenclature is different from one organization to the next, but the idea is the same. So the idea is if you have given your client options on how they would like to use their budget. So if you scope against their budget and you develop a scope, that scope becomes your communication timeline. That scope is not necessarily only a pricing guide or a pre-invoice, if you will. It becomes your communication timeline and your value timeline. So when you have the check-ins, it reduces the likelihood that someone's not going to pay you later or ignore your calls or quit on phase 3 of the project. So it reduces some of those 10th hour pricing conversations, which are typically, to my previous point, are typically a conversation about something else, not really pricing.
And then you made another comment about building the budget with your client. Mm-hmm. I know, like in my past, I actually, before doing specifically marketing, I do proposals, and clients would come to us with, here's the project, here's the amount of money we have to spend. You come back and tell us how you're going to spend our money to get this project done. How do you propose building that budget with a client after is that something that comes after they've accepted your proposal?
So I think it can work a couple of different ways. Under my pricing advice, one of my biggest pieces of advice is to always give options, to always give a menu of sorts, even if it's a simple menu. For $1,500, you can have this or this. You can spend this and get this. So one, I want to make sure I'm laying that as a foundation. There should almost always be options, because that is a simple way to involve your client in the budgeting and planning conversation. Now, when it comes to your question, when it comes to like, how do you develop that if a client approaches you and says, just build it and tell us what we can get for that? How I like to do that is I like to something as simple as saying, could we just have a call to walk through this together and make sure that I'm capturing the expectations for each phase of this, your options for where you might want to, again, swap it for your own cultural language, but where you might want to reduce costs, or where you might want to take it in-house, or where I think you could have a bigger impact. So I like to use that also as an option to a format to build in options. And then lastly, to me, it becomes just a simple conversation of, I want you to know that here are things that are going to make the price go up. and here are things that will reduce the cost. So if anything, just sitting down to walk them through what you've put together on your own and that perhaps you've done a 1,000 times to be like, this is going to cost you $1,500. I like it as a conversation that is kind of like a pre-scope creep conversation. So to me, it's just like another expectation setting. So it involves them in understanding how the sausage is made, and then sets the expectation around factors that may or may not take that budget off track, so that that conversation doesn't come at the end of an engagement, it comes during, so that there's a alignment on the front end of, if you take these 3 things in house, that will reduce your overall spend by this and allow you to spend it in this way. Or if there's a delay on these 3 parts, it will likely increase your overall spend by this much. It just helps have those conversations in marginal ways versus saving them for big disruptions when people are not apt to engage. Does that answer your question, Ryan, number 2?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I was just, in my world, when I wrote proposals, we just kind of put that in the proposal, like, if you fail on this part of the stage gets delayed, here's a note, this is going to mess up the rest of the process. So yeah, I just wondering, it's I guess it could go either way, a verbal conversation or in the actual proposal, and hope that they actually read the actual proposal itself, not just turn to the budget page.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so 2 additional thoughts on that. 1, how many of us have received proposals that no one follows up to say, could I walk you through that? So I would venture to guess that 80%, 85% of outside partners say, cool, I got your RFP or I got your request. Here's a proposal. I can't tell you, I recently left in-house, and I can't tell you, almost no one calls me after sending a proposal. Almost no one says, can I walk you through that to see if you have any questions? Can I walk you through that to make sure that I didn't miss anything, or that there isn't new information and, we can work on it together? No one does that. So huge differentiator out of the park, right? Even if you're just going through what you already drafted. 2, here's where the experience piece comes in. How does it feel when you say to me, hey, if you're a week late on that, I'm going to charge you an extra $1,500, versus saying, I want you to understand why this costs extra, or what can we do to make sure that there are no delays on your end and to leverage your time. So there's just a huge opportunity to verbally say to me, like, hey, I'm in this with you and I'm going to make you look good and I care about this, and I'm not looking to like upcharge you, extra charge you, past due fee charge you. I'm looking to be in this for the long term. And so it costs us an extra $1,500 when things get delayed. But let me walk you through why that is, and let's figure out how that's never going to happen. That's very different than me getting a proposal that says, if you're late, here's what's going to cost. And then let's say something happens, it was a horrible week, or one of my 4 kids didn't sleep, or blah, 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 blah. Then I just get a statement that says, well, it was in your thing and it's $1,500 extra. So when this essentially, Ryan, is like where that experience piece comes in. That feels like an investment in me. It feels like you care about me. It feels like a long-term partnership versus transactional.
Yeah, to be clear for everyone, if you do proposals, I used to leave all that stuff in the executive summary, knowing that they would never read past that. So highlight those differentiators right in the executive summary, letting people know up front, hey, if you don't read the next 60 pages, at least it was in the first 2.
Right. Great. Does anyone else have any other questions, or did something strike them as this would never fly in my organization? Or
2 things, but I have the benefit of getting to collaborate with Andrea, so forgive if somebody else wants to raise their hand, I'll stop. Takers? I'm seeing any hands. Okay, so 2 things then. All right, so the first one is the kind of the gut level pricing. So I'll just say, for a friend who's a consultant, she may be prone sometimes when she's engaging with a client who really, really, really wants to work with her, and for whatever reasons, the current organization isn't yet ready to attach the value. This with the fee, let's say maybe it's for a workshop or something, and that would be fairly finite in scope. Maybe there's a time during the course of the conversation, which is to say, all right, this is the typical fee, and here's why. Now you tell me what you need to get to yes with your our key stakeholders. So it's not a discounted rate, although I guess you could go back and do the math, but can you maybe talk a little bit about how that might be different than offering a discount up front, where you're saying, okay, I'm giving you the full, this is the price and this is why it's the price. And I want to invest in you and working with you in your organization. Tell me where you need to be in a frictionless or to get to yes kind of way. So if you can comment on maybe that method of showing value up front or putting some skin in the game up front, but not at the rate of saying, the workshops will always be at that lower entry point. Any comments around that, including that's a really bad idea? And then I'll tell my friend not to do that anymore.
Well, I feel like your question was a pretty good summary. So I feel like your question was a pretty good alternative idea and way to have those conversations on the front end. And I know that this happens often, especially when we want to give it away for free and give it away for free as an investment into a relationship, or we genuinely just want to help those around us, right? So I think, if I understand what you're asking, Deb, I think that for me, this goes back to just the communication place and where you have to choose your words carefully and where you have to think about that as a recipient of that goodwill. So there's a difference in saying like, well, that normally costs me, $5,000, but because I like you, I'm just going to do it, or I'm willing to do it for this much. Like that doesn't always feel as good. But to say like, my interest is in helping you. I value our relationship and I value the opportunity. I know that this is like one small snapshot of how we can work together, how we can collaborate. So you tell me what your budget is, and I will come back with options and how we can maximize that. So the difference between, those are similar conversations, slightly nuanced, but the difference in how that feels to receive that is light years. And the loyalty that you've just engendered, likely because that feels better, is insurmountable. And back to kind of that psychology, I'm a big fan of options. So even in that scenario, to say, you can carve out those options at the onset to be brought up later. So, this typically would cost a firm of your size $10,000. Now, I care about a relationship. I know that this is really important to you and to your firm. For $2,000, here's what we can deliver on, or we can deliver on this. Alternatively, like we can look forward to next year and figure out what we can scope for the 10,000, or how do we get you to 10,000? So then it feels, back to my collaboration point, it feels like you're in this together instead of I'm going to charge you, you're going to pay me. So it feels like a collaboration. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it did. And I think it is, even though you're describing this, it could be passed off as sort of like, oh, language schmanguage, but the nuances I think are really what I'm taking away, Andrea, from the way that you're conveying these constructs to us, is that it is in the nuances that can be the difference makers. The second point was on the proposal and sort of that experience of co-creating proposals. Having watched you convince a community of lawyers that sending blind proposals without follow-up conversations or walkthrough is sort of akin to, the death knell. It's the guarantee to lose kind of stake in the ground. Can you talk a little bit about that experience of the co-creation? I recall a few times with your pitch teams where a client was like, well, just send us a proposal. And you were instructing the team to say, we can't do our best work unless we walk you through the building of the proposal and sort of that kind of back and forth. I know in some cases you've said, we don't send proposals without walking our clients through them. So if you'll give me 15, 20 minutes, so just sort of establishing that that's a standard in your sales method to simulate the client experience. Any commentary you can give around just your psychology at holding a boundary early in that process, or why you won't want to run the temptation of getting it on paper and hope that it works out?
Sure. Thanks for raising that point. I think that does speak to what the sales culture is like in your organization. And the bigger conversation here is that these tools right now are not, a proposal is not just part of your sales, it's part of your CX. So a proposal, a pricing conversation, that intro call, those are all actually that's actually where your onboarding starts, right? So not to throw around a bunch of like CX terminology, but that's really where your experience starts. Your future client's experience with your firm doesn't start with the first engagement. It starts with the first time they encounter you, and it starts with those first conversations, and then the expectations start around the scoping and the pricing. So to Deb's point, I am a firm believer in not engaging or delivering kind of blindly. So if I am going to engage in a relationship with you that is, a professional relationship in which I deliver something of value, I believe it not a one size fits all. And I think when you say to the potential client, I'm not willing to just give you a price, or I'm not willing to just blindly send you what's worked for other clients. Like, it's really important for me to understand your needs, your objectives, and make sure we have the appropriate solutions. There's immediate trust. There's immediate trust, and there's immediate respect for yourself, your organization, and your product that you're delivering. So again, I think when you look at it from a sales perspective versus an experience and relationship perspective, you're like, just give the client what they want. Like, this is how we're going to win the business. We're going to send them a bomb ass proposal that has a website and a video and a logo, and we're going to win. Versus saying, like, look, we want to have a meaningful engagement with you, and it would do no one any service if we sent you a bunch of stuff that we've already sent someone else. Like, nobody wants that. You don't even want to read that. So if you would give me 15 minutes of time to make sure that I can deliver on what you need, then it'll be worthwhile. And if I can't help you, I will find someone to help you. Like, the difference in those conversations is remarkable. And you're setting your expectation and kicking off your CX program at that point. This is what it feels like to be a client at our firm. We respect your time. We're focused on your objectives, and we're not just going to cookie cutter give you some shiz that we just deliver to everybody else. So it feels very one-off, even if it's part of your sales protocol as an organization. It feels very custom. And that, to talk about experience, to me, experience and value is save you money, make you money. What does it feel like to be your client? That's value right there. So thank
Andrea?
you. Yes.
A question based on what you just described. I heard that as a pre-proposal meeting and discussion to identify the problems to be solved, as opposed to a post. You're advising both, correct? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am. But obviously to different degrees of the spectrum. So at the very bare minimum, it should, and it depends on like what you received, right? Like, if you received a super holistic RFP that looks like it went to 100 people, and they may or may not be receptive to that, but you may as well get the points for asking. One. Two, you may as well use every tool in your toolkit to make sure that what you're pitching is appropriately targeted, priced, aligned with their objectives. So on the front end, on the pre-proposal, I suggest and recommend using any tool in your toolkit, and this is one of them. Post-proposal could be anything from, we will only submit if you agree to do a 15-minute call because we don't want to waste anyone's time and manage expectations, to one line, we are here, here's an option, here's how we'd like to connect on this next. So there's a whole spectrum of how you utilize this tool, but the point is you have it as a tool in your toolkit, and most often it's not used at any stage of a proposal process.
And who here has seen a client submit an RFP where they were wrong in one of their core assumptions about what they needed to solve their problem?
All of them.
Right.
So,
I mean, it's pretty alarming if you think about it. Like, when you take a step back out of it, I think we're just always in our professions in the frenzy of our to-do list and to winning the business, that we don't stop to actually say, wait a minute here, like, this isn't working, or there's a better way, or if this is worth, $50,000, why wouldn't we take that extra step of including this as an offering?
right.
So
One of my favorite proposals I ever did, just because the client told me afterwards it was by far the best proposal I'd ever seen. So of course I love it, but the request came in and my response was, we're not going to help you do what you asked for because it's not going to accomplish what you said you're wanting to accomplish. So I'm going to take a gamble here and propose an alternative to what you asked for that, based on our experience, is going to get you more of what you're trying to achieve. And boy, that was a tricky proposal to have to write, but they're a great client, and it's been a fun project. So
Well, and I don't want to derail us too much, but you're speaking right into like my favorite conversations, and that's playing the short-term game versus the long-term game. So when you're willing to be courageous enough and honest enough and vulnerable enough to say that, you're playing the long-term game. You're not playing how am I going to get this 50 grand in the door. You're looking at that opportunity as 10 years and 10 million. So usually I find that individuals are just about checking the box, numbers, busy, their to-do list, their sales quotas, their all these things. And when you're willing to engage in that way, it's definitely a long-term strategy.
So I have a question on that. And before you even said that, I was hoping to ask this question. When we do have long-term relationships, how can you talk about increasing the fee? People get raises. That's just how the economy works. How can you have that conversation without the client being like, well, I want that per diem from 10 years ago back?
That's a great question, and I'm glad that you raised it. So I think it depends on the industry that you're in, and it depends on your company, and it depends on those client relationships. But also reinforces why it's important that your clients understand how the sausage is made at the beginning. So on the simple side of things, I think it's important just to have an initial conversation that says, we'd like to increase the rate. Here's why. So here's why we'd like to do this. We'd like to have a conversation. We'd like to involve you in this. Also, I think it's important to share at some point throughout relationships on how you came up with your pricing and how your pricing models are. So again, like I said, you're anchoring it. And it's important to consider how those conversations are had throughout, because there are different means of pricing. You might price according to market, you might price according to demand, and you might price according to expertise or delivery, right? So there's different ways, or within your own organization, there are different, like Deb's rate might increase everyone else's rate, or this person might have capacity, so they have a different rate. So I think the first step in that is to make sure that your client understands how you're coming up with those prices. And that's not necessarily around, look, we hired 5 more people, we need to keep the lights on. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about your lights. That's not their responsibility. So I think it's important, one, if in an ideal scenario, is to have those kind of conversations as you go along, understanding what went into the price. You're adding it to the invoice, you're building out those success measures, you're giving them some insights. I think it's important to have those conversations directly versus email, or adding it to the invoice, or an annual statement that says we're increasing our billing by XYZ. I think it's also important to tie it to what they might get in addition when that price goes up. So if when you raise prices and you say you're raising prices because it's no longer market, or your company has grown, or there's a higher demand, that becomes all about you and not about the client. So it's important that you identify ways that price increase, or that additional cost, or that conversation becomes about them and the impact and the value to them. So over time, we've seen X amount. We've been able to accomplish this. We'd love to be able to spend more time doing this. And in assessing our relationship here, we think this is in line with blah, blah, blah. So another key tenet of getting your pricing right is making sure that there's mutual risk. There's mutual risk and mutual investment. And that's kind of an important piece of each conversation. Did that answer your question, or did it feel too rambly?
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's really helpful. We definitely struggle with in all cases, it's about us. Our company's grown. We need you to pay more. And so this has been really helpful. Thank you.
Well, and I think honestly, if you're looking for like a tactical solution, I think when you have a conversation and you're looking for feedback and opportunity, in most cases, if you've been delivering on what you've promised and you've been delivering value, clients are happy to pay that increase. So it's the fear of they're going to be like, oh, it's not, you're not worth it. Then kind of to a previous point, you have a different conversation on your hand, which you're fortunate to have then. So if anything, opening with a pricing conversation to say, here's where we're at, we'd like to increase, or we'd like to talk about this, or we'd like to scope differently around this, then you're inviting the conversation that's a piece of feedback about your value, which is scary and time consuming. And most people are hesitant to step into that. But if you approach a client and let's just say you you simply say, we're raising our rates. We want to talk to you about this. You'll expect to see this amount of increase for this delivery, or here's how it might affect our scoping for next year, something along those lines. If they're hesitant, then that's an insight that you have to have followed. You're on a different path. You're not on necessarily a pricing path. So your pricing is kind of like your doorway into multiple hallways.
Very helpful. Thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome.
Don't underestimate good clients who want you to be well compensated. Anyone who's ever done business with a friend, one of my best friends is a mechanic, and he constantly refuses to take my money or dramatically undercharges. And it makes me feel bad bringing stuff to him. And there's times I've brought something somewhere else because I didn't want him to give me another gift just because I'm his friend and he won't take my money. So there's some interesting psychology at play at times when a client really likes you and wants you to be successful as well.
Well, I hope he leaves the price tag off that gift.
That's hilarious. Yeah, and I mean, it reinforces kind of my professional opinion about having a conversation together early on, because when you can enter in a pricing conversation with mutual risk, and that's really what it is, like, and it's fair, it's mutual fairness, right? Like we deserve to be compensated for the work we provided, and most people and most clients are reasonable in that regard. And so when you enter into those conversations all along, it doesn't feel like a me versus you, which is the default for money conversations. Is a I have to win or you have to win. And so that's why some of those early on conversations about money are really, really crucial. Outside of just kind of setting the stage for your experience, they create that mutual investment.
Well, Andrea, this was amazing. We've gone right up almost to the hour, and it flew by. I just looked down at the clock and realized how quickly time went. Thank you so much. A great conversation, guys. Loved your answers. I see probably more questions in the mural than I've seen on any of these KSMs, and I don't think we could spend the rest of the day and get them all answered. So great topic.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you everybody for spending your lunch hour with me. I did pull out just the ideas portion out of my presentation and out of my YouTube link. I typed up just my ideas for each section. So if you would like a copy of that so that you don't have to listen to that video again or read the full article, shoot me an email at Andrea. Oh, I'll type it in here. Shoot me an email at andrea@theprequel.com. And I'm happy to send you just the one pager that says, here's 3 ideas for pricing. Here's 3 ideas for statement of work. Here's 3 ideas for invoices. Something super simple and easy to work from. But I appreciate everyone spending their lunch hour with me.
Any final words of advice or wisdom before we wrap it for the day?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh.
You're the expert of the hour.
Any final? So yeah, sure. I'll give you some final thoughts. So tips, great. These are all great, right? How do you take them back and actually implement them? Like, who cares about great ideas if you can't actually do anything with them? So first thought, attach to something that already exists. You don't have to create something completely new. You don't need a whole program. You don't need a whole new invoicing system. You don't need to roll out a firm-wide proposal generator, blah, blah, blah. Start with something that exists and make small tweaks. Whether that's a 1-sentence impact statement, whether that's a verbal phone call, start with attached to what already works. 2, start with a pilot group of willing. So if you cannot roll out organization-wide changes of you're going to do a pre-proposal phone call or a post-proposal phone call, start with 3 or 4 people you know would be willing to do this, who believe in what you're doing, believe in the impact, and are open to change. From there, record and compare the impact. So, which again, I guess leads me to my third point, which is measure what you're doing. So if you're able to get 3 or 4 super fans, early adopters to try some of these techniques, relationships, measure from the start of now to the end of the year. Measure the win-loss ratio, measure the client growth, measure the anecdotal feedback, measure whatever you are able to, and use that to drive organizational change. So 3 last ideas: attach to what already exists, find a early adopter group, and then measure anything you possibly can to drive organizational change.
Andrea, I think in 3 minutes, you just summed up the wisest advice anyone could do for anything involving CX in their industry, not just around pricing. That was incredible. Tom, we've got this recorded. Let's write that up. Let's plagiarize it like crazy.
Borrow and maximize.
Borrow and maximize. Borrow and maximize with attribution. That was great stuff. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. We'll leave the Zoom open for any chit chat for those who want to stick around, but this does formally conclude our time together.